The webinar is now live and we can begin.
Great, thank you, Elena. Welcome everybody to the third session of our Talk Story series, Lessons from the Past Informing Our Present and Future Work. My name is Amanda Watson, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The Talk Story series is brought to you by Praxis International with support from the Office on Violence Against Women. Praxis is a nonprofit organization that works to end all forms of gender-based violence through local, statewide, and national social justice initiatives. This session is being live captioned, and we have put information about how to access the captions in the chat box. In a minute, we're going to give a summary of last week's sessions, but before we jump into that, I'm going to ask Elena to share with us some reminders about today's technology. So Elena?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. We are on a Zoom webinar today, so all participants' cameras and microphones are turned off, so no one can see or hear you if you're on and watching this webinar. To communicate with us as panelists with any issues, and especially with your questions once we dive into discussion, please use the Q&A feature, which you can find on the toolbar across the bottom of your screen. Additionally, as Amanda mentioned, we do have live captioning today. You can enable that on the toolbar on the bottom of your screen where it says CC and live transcript. There should be an arrow button there as well where you can click and show subtitle. That will have live subtitles across the bottom of the screen. And as mentioned, there is live captioning, and so errors are possible. We appreciate your patience with that. We also have ASL interpreting available for today's call, as you can see. Thanks. Back to you, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Elena. As we begin our time together today, on behalf of all of us at Praxis International, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the events both of last Tuesday and of yesterday, and to pause to honor the 8 individuals who were killed last week in Atlanta in an act of racist, misogynist violence, as well as the victims of the mass shooting in Boulder yesterday. We have a slideshow on screen now of the people who were lost to these acts of violence. And we mourn deeply the loss of so many lives. We're sending our heartfelt support and condolences to the 18 families that have lost their loved ones. We are all diminished by their passing and by the horrific manner in which they were killed. It's both painful and ironic that the murders in Atlanta took place last week at about the same time that over 70 of us were coming together from around the country during our second Talk Story session to visit with each other about the state of our advocacy and how to work for a world of peace and liberation. And in particular today, we want to address the devastation of the Atlanta murders and what they represent. A spectrum of racially motivated bias and violence perpetrated against Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. What happened in Atlanta wasn't an isolated incident, but is instead part of a long history of oppression and hatred of Asian American people that has deep roots in the United States. And we believe that it's essential to name this for what it is: anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Native racism and xenophobia, homophobia, sexism, and anti-trans bigotry. And these are not separate or distinct. They all come from white male supremacy that uses violence to oppress through dehumanization and through instilling fear. We believe that it is essential that we all come together to act to stop the violence and bigotry perpetrated against Asian American people in our communities. All of our work to end gender-based violence is inextricably linked to ending racist oppression and changing the beliefs and policies that perpetuate it. And we invite you to join us by standing in solidarity with Asian communities and all those feeling fear and outrage in the aftermath of this violence. We challenge everyone here today to take some action, however small, to stop the violence. It is up to all of us to make visible the oppression perpetrated against Asian Americans and all Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We call on each and every one of us to recommit to working collectively to stop the violence. One simple action that all of us can take today is to sign on in support of a collective statement by Asian Americans advancing justice in Atlanta and the Georgia NAACP. We'll put the link to that statement in the chat so that anybody can sign it and share it as part of our work to create change. But before we do so, we want to pause and take a moment of silence to honor the lives lost and reflect on the work that lies ahead of us to ensure that this violence does not continue into the future. Thank you, everyone. And I encourage all of you to continue to do whatever is in your power to stand and provide support and show solidarity to all Asian Americans and Asian immigrants and all folks and communities of color who are experiencing this violence on an ongoing basis. And also to take care of yourselves during our session today. Now, this Talk Story series is meant to offer an opportunity for us all to pause and reflect on the paths and the history and the roots that have led us collectively to where we are today, and what meaning that has for where we want to go in the future. And some of you may have been able to join us for the prior two sessions. But for some of you, this might be the first one you've attended. And so before we transition into more of a discussion and dialogue with the panelists and folks that we have with us today, Diane is going to give a brief recap of what took place in the prior two sessions. So Diane, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you and welcome to all of you in our audience and to our panelists today. As Amanda mentioned in our first session, we heard from this group of panelists who is back with us today about where our work to end gender-based violence is at this moment in time and where it may be going, particularly after the events of 2020 that continue to reverberate here as we arrive in the spring of 2021. And as Amanda described, the recent and horrifying violence that continues. We'd like to welcome back our panelists. We're so grateful for you joining us for this discussion today. They are Kenosha Davenport, the Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Center in Minnesota. Kenosha also serves as board chair for the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Welcome to you, Kenosha. Sarah Curtis is back with us. Sarah is the co-executive director of Men as Peacemakers and is also a circle keeper with the Minnesota Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Welcome to you, Sarah. Guadalupe Fernadez works as a policy and advocacy manager with Tahirih Justice Center. She's based out of Houston. Welcome, Guadalupe. Thank you for being here. Mira Yusef is a founder and the executive director of Monsoon Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity. We're happy to have you back with us, Mira. Thank you for being here. And Kata Asari is the executive director of Praxis International and is also a founding member of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. Kata, welcome to you. All of these amazing people are advocates, they're educators and organizers with a wealth of experience who have worked to end gender-based violence and intersecting oppression locally, nationally, and transnationally. We're happy to welcome them back for today's conversation and are grateful to learn from their experience and their wisdom. In that first session, panelists explored both joys and challenges related to our work, from the power of community-centered intergenerational organizing to the pitfalls of the professionalization of advocacy. They raised questions about the future of our work to end gender-based violence, as many advocacy programs move away from an anti-oppression focus and begin to look more and more like the very systems we're trying to change, with funding that often directs what programs do. And they talked as well about what path might lead us in a different direction, might lead us toward a world of equity and liberation for all. In our second session, small groups of advocates, including many of you here with us today, from across the country, gathered in breakouts to discuss what we heard from the panelists and share some of our own thoughts and questions. Thank you to all of you who participated and to the Praxis staff and consultants who facilitated and provided assistance. In addition to Amanda and Elena, who have already said hello, they include Ku Chang, Bree Adams-Bill, Patrice Anthony, Marin Woods, Shelley Stoffel, Amalfi Parker Elder, and Liz Carlson. You'll be hearing from some of them today as they return to pose to our panelists some of the questions that came up in those breakout sessions. As we turn to our time together today, we want to start with working agreements. At Praxis, we begin every staff meeting by reading these and recommitting to them as a framework to guide our interactions. So we'll be using these for our time together today as well. I'm going to ask Elena to share screen, and then our panelists will join me. Our panelists and our Praxis staff will join me in reading these. And I'll turn to our first person to start us out.
We are here to learn together, to exchange ideas, to think critically, ask questions, dialogue, and pose solutions respectfully. We acknowledge that all forms of oppression exist and are likely to surface from time to time.
We acknowledge that one aspect of institutionalized oppression is that we have systematically been taught misinformation about our own group and about members of other groups. We agree to actively pursue opportunities to learn new information that questions what we have been taught and to listen respectfully to unfamiliar perspectives.
We agree to not blame ourselves or others for the misinformation we have learned, but to accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. We agree not to blame those that experience oppression for the conditions of their lives.
We assume that everyone is doing the best they can. We agree that we will not demean, devalue, or in any way put down people for their experiences.
We agree to actively challenge the myths and stereotypes about our own groups and other groups so that we can build our connections while also breaking down the walls that separate us. We want to create a comfortable atmosphere for open discussion. Anyone is welcome to ask that their comments not be repeated. And please share others' personal information and/or comments only with their explicit consent.
We embrace the differences and similarities among us, encouraging everyone to self-monitor to ensure all have equitable opportunity to participate. We challenge ourselves to communicate in new ways, including making time for silence, reflection, and processing. We agree to attend to our needs by nurturing ourselves, mind, body, and spirit.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for reading through those. And if anyone is interested in a copy of these working agreements for reference, we are happy to share them after today's session. So again, we just want to say how grateful all of us are that you're here with us and taking time out of your days to be part of this conversation. And we're so grateful also for all of the work that you're doing in your communities. We're looking forward to seeing where the conversation takes us today about the future of advocacy and the world that we're trying to build. If you have any needs during the session, or if you have any feedback for us after the session, please do let us know. We always appreciate your feedback, and we'll be sending you an evaluation. But if anything comes up in the meantime, you can get in touch with us. We do want you to know that we've established protections against Zoom bombing for today's session. But if you encounter any problems, please let us know. And you can email elena@praxisinternational.org right away, and we'll copy that email into the chat for you to access. And just to reiterate that this is a really tender time for a lot of folks for lots of different reasons. And we want to ensure that everybody is able to access whatever support is most meaningful and is going to help you find those connections and those ways to keep building relationships and moving forward. And so these sessions that we've been doing as part of the Talk Story have raised some difficult and sometimes painful conversations and topics. And so if you do need additional emotional support during or after the session, you can email advocacy@praxisinternational.org. And we're happy to connect with you that way to work out how best to support you. And that email address has just been copied into the chat for reference, and someone will be monitoring that during today's session. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and dive into conversation with our panelists. Again, a reminder that for those of you in the audience today, you can use the Q&A feature if you have more questions that are coming up for you as the panelists are talking. And as Diane mentioned, we have some questions and themes that are going to be shared for the panelists to respond to that came out of these small group conversations that took place at last week's session. And so we have the facilitators and representatives from each of those small groups here today who are going to share a little bit about what came up during those conversations last week and pose one of the questions that all of you wanted to hear from the panelists. So, perks of being one of the moderators for the panel, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with something that came up in my small group last week, which there was a really rich conversation about just how much has happened over the decades since this work began, and how much knowledge individuals have about that history and all of the work that's been done, but also about how difficult it can be, particularly for folks that weren't around when this work started or who are just coming into the work now, to connect to that history and to hear those stories and to really understand the depth and breadth of everything that has happened in our work to end gender-based violence. And so one question that was raised in my small group was, how do we make that history more visible? And how do we make that history of our movement visible in a way that doesn't reduce it down and erase the complexities and nuances of everything that's taken place? And so that's the question that I'll kick us off with. And Sarah, I wonder if you have any thoughts or initial reactions to that, because I know you talked a little bit about that intergenerational component and bringing the past forward with us during the first session. So any reactions to that question?
Yes, that is a really good question. You know, we think about, so I came up, you know, I think I talked about this in my first session, as like a punk that came in thinking that I didn't, you know, I was 20 years old, and I had some life and some experience, and being a survivor myself, when I found I could work with other survivors, I like threw myself all the way into it. And you know, in my work, the way that I learned, you know, my college in this was from my elders, you know, listening and people coming through. You know, I think of someone I'm so lucky to have been in community with since I was very young, Tina Olson, who is a native, she's Yaqui, a native elder that taught me things. I would come, you know, in that energy that we have as young people, right? Which is good. And like, it's good to have that energy. And I would come in with all the fire, and I would be like, and and then and Tina, she probably still will say this to me, but she would say, slow your roll. And then she would talk to me about like, have you considered? And when you look at the history of our movement and how important the elders were to really lay the path down for us, you know, I think of the matriarch here, Alice Lynch, you know, that when Alice walked into a room, she like, the energy changed because she held the community with such love and respect and patience. And for me is that so many of these elders in the movement are people who were invisibilized by like choice, where they absolutely would not ever step into the front because that wasn't, you know, they had philosophies that meant that wasn't right for them, or like they were not public speakers and didn't like it. And so they would elevate the leadership of other people to do it. Or they were just not recognized because they were, you know, we would say BIPOC now, like they were people who were not, you know, just were not visible because of their different cultural identities, or were not cisgender women, or were not, you know, so many reasons why they would be invisibilized. And so when I think about making that history visible, the first thing I do is like, one thing I do is I always sit at the table with my elders if I get a chance. Like I always, you know, very, still feeling like a 20-year-old with my plate of food at a conference and being like, can I sit here? Right. and listening to them talk and to take in those stories and to take in. And I think the one thing, especially about the elders, that I want to also caution is that we can't throw out their wisdom because their language hasn't kept up with what is most up to date about how we might refer to things, you know? And so like listening and taking that wisdom in and then bringing their names into the room. Like if you know an elder that has come, you know, Linda Oman, an elder from Red Lake who was murdered in February, in her home. She worked, you know, since the mid 1990s in tribal communities here in Minnesota to do that work. And she was a quiet and loving auntie. You know, I think we do not need to attach to white supremacy like the written word. I think the oral tradition and the stories of our elders from the movement are so, so important to like say their names out loud, talk about what they did. I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in where people have said, oh, I had no idea they were part of that organization. I had no idea, right? And so to start that oral history and like to value that storytelling, you know, instead of getting into a room where we're like, you know, okay, how's work? How's this grant? Like, where's the objectives? Have you received your funding yet? Have you blah, 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 blah? Like all of these things that we do when we have these snippets of time is to take that place, because one thing that I'm so deeply grateful that I have learned from my elders in the movement is that they built the nonviolence movement on being in right relationship with each other, you know, and they did not always agree. Ooh, some of those belly laughing conversations where they talk about how they fought with each other and like how they didn't like each other till like 2 years ago and like having all of those things, you know, it didn't mean that they were always in deep agreement, but the fact that they built relationship, you know, they knew each other's families and their children and their grandchildren, like they knew, they took the time to talk story about what was happening with them, and they still do, what is happening in their communities. And the fact that even now, even if they may be retired or they're like not going into, they don't have the energy to be in the community all the time the way they once were, is that the fact that they're elders right now is like they have a gift in our communities that people come and talk to them in a different way than maybe they would come talk to me. Like they talk to people in a much different way. And so I think that, you know, the history of our folks, it doesn't just have to be how they are memorialized in the written word or by a scholarship fund or by like something, an award banquet. Like those are not the ways that we have to keep going on with that. But I think, you know, take the time and learn the stories of the elders around you. Learn the stories about the not white elders in your movement that are in your community because they're there. And then talk those stories. Like all the time, you know, invoke their names into the room, you know, hold their wisdom close to you. Those things, like even now when there are hard times, there's stories of my elders that have actually, those that are still here and those who are with the ancestors right now, that give me strength and power when I don't feel like I got it, right? And it's because of those stories of what they did and who they were.
Miigwech, Sarah. Oh, yeah, so much in there. And I think that call to anybody who's listening to this right now or in the future to think about, if you don't know who those elders are in your community, that's something to think about in the first place, is why don't you know who those people are? Why are they not more visible already? And then B, how can you cultivate those relationships? How can you listen? How can you invoke them and carry on that storytelling tradition that Sarah's talking about? I think that's something that each of us can do in our own communities, in our own ways, as one more tangible action of making that history visible and carrying it forward with us. So thank you, Sarah. And Kata, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
Well, Sarah, that was so beautifully said. And I actually don't have very much to add to it because I could feel my heart resonating as you were speaking, because so much of what you said is something I think a lot about as someone who is, moving out of this work probably in the next 10 or 15, 20 years, and has been here a long time. Just a couple of maybe elaborations on what Sarah said, because I really think that you captured it so beautifully. One is that I think that we live in a country in the United States that tends to both erase history and erase people, certain people, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, women, trans people, out of history. And I think it's, and what's important about that is that's the context within which we do this work. And it's really easy when that's around us all the time to take on that similar way of being in anti-violence work. And so I would really challenge everyone to be aware of that context, that the history of how we got here and who brought us here isn't valued in general in the United States, but in particular in this field or in this movement. And even the history that I think a lot of people now have about how domestic violence and sexual assault and related gender-based violence work evolved, as Sarah mentioned, is not representative of the many, many, many Native and women of color that really were fundamental to this work starting. And so I think the first piece for me is to think about what our frame is and to recognize that the acknowledging and holding present history is of tremendous value to us. I think a lot of us who come from communities of color, Native communities, this is a natural part of how we move through our lives and our days. And it is something that tends to get disconnected when we move into kind of white mainstream hierarchical organizations. And yet, as Sarah said, we wouldn't be here without all of the work of those tremendous leaders and elders. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we don't acknowledge that and learn about that. So I similarly was thinking about the importance of learning the non-formal historical information about how we got here. And to do that, as Sarah said, to speak to the elders in this work. And I really appreciated, Sarah, how you acknowledged in such a beautifully tactful way that it's not just the famous elders, right? It's not just the names that we all know, like the Ellen Pences who started this organization, but the folks who've been doing the work day in, day out for decades. I also think that there's the other couple of things I would just add is the power of making the time and space for that kind of connection. And I remember when I started out in this work, I went to one of the 40-hour trainings. And that was a long time ago. That was in the 80s, late 80s. But the first thing that we learned in that training is the history of how this field, this movement was created. And I have, in the last 15 years, been a part of planning or looking at those kind of trainings. And that history piece is usually left out. Because we're so eager to get to other issues, that kind of training up advocates and people to do this. And I would really challenge everyone who's listening to find ways to bring that history back and to bring it back in the informal ways of talking and finding out, how did you get here? Who brought you into this work and who came before you? But also to tell the story to each other and to those of us in our community. Last time the panelists were all here, the first session, we talked a lot about Audre Lorde. And as Sarah was speaking, I was thinking about another favorite phrase of mine from Audre Lorde, which is that silence and invisibility go hand in hand with powerlessness. And as much as I have a critique of this movement, which I shared last time, I also think it's amazingly remarkable, the powerful work that we've done to get to this place. But we did that because our history was a part of our present and it was moving us into the future. And I think when we discount or we don't acknowledge or we don't make visible that history, that we're really contributing to our own powerlessness. So that making visible and doing it in the context of community, I think, is so essential. And then the last thing I would say about this just really quickly is I don't think, sometimes I've heard both folks who've been in the work a long time as well as newer folks say, you know, well, is it that we want to go back? You know, do we want to go back to what we did at the beginning? And I see Sarah shaking her head. That's absolutely right. It's not, it's taking our history with us is what moves us forward. So it's not about going back to what we did before, because honestly, I feel like the level of creativity and embracing of possibility that folks who are new into this work inspires and moves me daily and teaches me and helps me to continue the work. But to recognize that if we do that in a vacuum, that we're not really doing it in the fullest way that will have that powerful impact that we have. So embracing our history and keeping it in our present, I think really moves us well into our future.
Great. Thank you so much, Kata, for all of that. I wish, Mike, I could spend a whole panel, the whole hour and a half just listening to folks talk about this one question. But I know there were fabulous things that the other small groups were sharing about as well. So Diane, I know you were in Abby's group, and Abby isn't able to join us this week. And since you were there for the conversation, I wonder if you want to share a little bit about what came up in your small group and what the panelists might have to say about that.
Sure, absolutely. Kenosha was in that group too, so I'm going to ask her to weigh in on this question. But part of what came up in our breakout is, and was revealed once again, is the reality that advocates come into this work with varying levels of experience with and understanding of oppression. And that really many advocates see their role purely as a helper, for lack of a better word. So the question that we have, or one of the many that we narrowed down, is how might we strengthen the ways that we educate advocates on oppression in general and the anti-oppression focus of our work? And even though, of course, advocates provide essential support for survivors and do help them, are there ways to recenter anti-oppression and social change work as part of what it means to be an advocate? There's an easy question for you. Kenosha, you want to start us out?
Yes, I'm happy to get started with this question. Well, one of the things that I think has to be done is an intentional action on behalf of the organizations that many of us work for, right? Whether that's in the orientation and onboarding process. And if some of you are on the call and you don't necessarily have control in that process, there are other ways, like our volunteer training. Working with our volunteers to understand and educate them around how the anti-oppression focus of our work is also key, you know. And so I just spent the last few weeks scattered across 3 different days working with Mincasa on their strategic plan. And so one of the things that we talked about at the board and staff level was like, how do we make sure that this is part of our framework? How do we make sure that this is a part of the lens? So as you know, depending on what your role is in the organization, there's different ways in which you can bring this work forward and keep it at the forefront. Always being open to dialogue, you know, making sure that we're when we're in those spaces where we're having these discussions, that you're also following up with the how. But how do we plan to do that as an organization? You know, I think a lot of time we focus on what we want to do or where we need to be, and then there's less focus on the action part. And I know that in this year, 2021, right, my goal is to see more action. and being intentional about asking the how, so when you're in a staff meeting or you're networking with other advocates, it's like, okay, so we have identified, we spent numerous years, right, talking about what the problem is, identifying what we could be doing. And it's like, okay, but how are we going to do this? And I know we'll talk a little bit about funding, so I won't start in on that, but just, like how do we see this playing out? And then like both Sarah and Kata said, is the seek information and to ask questions, right? Constantly being an open, a open cup, a cup that isn't already completely filled, because we know that by understanding the history of this movement, that keeps us from repeating some of the same missteps. But it also gives us some, what I like to tell people all the time is like, tell me what you learned in the fire. Like, yes, I get it that when you started down that path that it didn't work out. For me, it's so helpful to understand like what went wrong, so that if we're working on something similar, that I don't make those same missteps. So seek information, ask questions.
Thank you, Kenosha. And such a reminder too of how all of this conversation overlaps, even though we have these separate questions. I think it all harkens back to what's already been said and what will be said. Sarah, what are your thoughts on this question?
What are my thoughts? Hey. Okay, stretch. If you are not doing this work, what are you doing in this movement? That is the number one thing. And I think about when I started at the organization that I'm currently at, and I met with being a not white director of the organization, of a mainstream organization. And I went and took some folks out to lunch, some folks of color that had worked for the organization, just like had some real talk with them and said, like, how was it for you? Like, how was it for you there? Like, what was going on? And, sometimes when we're working on intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, things around that, folks, one of the young men that I'd work with talked to me and he said, you could spend your whole time working at Men as Peacemakers and not talk about race once. And I was like, oh, that's a problem. That's a problem, and so, really focusing in on remembering that it's a practice. It is a practice. It is like an every single day practice. It's something that you do, that you embed into your institution. Like, it is a practice that you have. It is not something where you simply have a one training that provides a little bit of language. It's like, what voices are you bringing in the room? Who are you elevating on your social media pages? What resources are you normalizing? Like, how are you embedding the practice in like absolutely every single thing you do? And I think about how this works for myself, right? Being a Native director of a mainstream organization, right? Is that also, my dear friend Alexis Flanagan says this, and I will censor myself because OVW, but she says, say the whole effing truth all at once. And so what we also in that practice and what the movement has taught us is that, okay, today we focus on Indigenous people. Tomorrow we focus on, right? And we segment them and we focus just on one person's oppression at once, when they are all systematically linked to each other, and oppression is a system. So with oppression being a system, right, we have to have the practice of consistently standing against systematic oppression. Because if the work you do is either on a level in administration, like how are you working with the people in your organization to dismantle systematic oppression, or the folks walking through your door. Like I will never forget going and talking to advocates who had wanted some training on Indigenous folks and coming in because my earring game is tight, y'all. You should see my earring collection. It's tight. Like I don't play with my earrings. And I came in and she looked at my earrings and she was like, oh, those are beautiful. I was like, yeah, I know. Thanks. And she said, oh, is there like a spiritual significance to the color of the beads in your earrings? And, you know, I right? Because if you're talking to me like that, then how are you interacting with an Indigenous woman coming through your door who's seeking services? And so it's also not a shame-based thing, right? We all come with our privileges and oppressions. You know, we all come through the doors in those kinds of ways. And so for me, it's a practice like, you know, for example, you know, even being an Indigenous person, I am not a Black-bodied person. So I have to wake up every single day actively addressing anti-Blackness, right? Like I don't get a pass because I'm an Indigenous person. I still have to practice, you know, how I'm dismantling anti-Blackness. And then looking at the wholeness of the picture too, as we're getting into that practice, is that how are you not only elevating the oppression that you see, but like the joy and brilliance and creativity of folks at the same time? You know, how are you elevating their work and how are you elevating their, yeah, just what they create, documentaries, art, music, like how are you also elevating those things? Because there's this thing that we can do because we are so focused on creating a world that is more safe for people, that we can get into that just trauma and oppression spiral where we don't see folks as whole people, right? And so how are we also elevating, you know, brilliance and joy and being in that space and really being, you know, a good relative to the people in our communities? Like, how are we acting in a way that is being that good relative and thinking in that way? Because you can't know everything about a culture that is not yours. You can't. Like, it's impossible. It's impossible to know. But like, you know how to be a good guest in someone else's house. Like, you do know how to do that. You know, take your shoes off. Don't go in the fridge. Like, you know, take the cup of coffee. And my grandma was always decaf, right? Like, take that cup of coffee, sit down, you know, and be that good guest in someone else's house. And so looking at, you know, if you're not able to do the whole, how can you think about it as a practice of like, how am I going to be a good guest in someone else's house? And then when you have that relationship with someone, then you know how to stand next to someone, because also, you know, we have to take it from our academic brain into our body. And how are we embodying it? Because if someone is killed in your neighborhood, you are not going to stand on the corner with your copy of White Fragility and talk about the analysis of everything that is happening, right? You are going to go cook a pot of soup and bring it over to their home, right? And so how do we stop thinking about oppression and anti-oppression just here, and move it into our body? And like my sister Kenosha said, how do we do motion? How do we do action? How are we actually in and of the community so that our gifts and skills and talents are woven in with everybody else's gifts and skills and talents, and we can move together?
Yes, I love that the practice of motion, the practice of action, and knowing that there's never that one singular thing that you can just do and then check the box and say, okay, I did it. I've done everything I need to do on this now. And the necessity of that, and of holding each other accountable and in loving community as we all go through that regular practice. Thank you, Diana. Great question. Really good insights from your group. And Bree, I wonder if you want to share a little bit about what came up in your group now and the questions that you have.
Absolutely. So we began, as you mentioned, Amanda, the first session with some talking about the over-professionalization of advocacy. And during the small group last week, we were talking more about that. Over the years, you know, we've absolutely seen an increase in the professionalization of advocacy. We were talking about how there was some agreement that in ways having that happen seemed to be a detriment to our work. One example we identified was the impact being a decrease in our connection to community, if you will. And we further tried to explore how this notion of over-professionalization is a problem. We began to name how it might be a problem, wondered aloud together what signs we should be looking for, and really asking the question, what does over-professionalization actually mean? And then by the close of the group, we began to just at the very beginning, start questioning how we might address this impact, how we may correct our course moving forward. And so ultimately asking, what can we actually do about it? And so I'm just curious, Mira, I'll ask you first, what you think about this and what more you might add to this notion, reality that advocacy has been over-professionalized. What would you say?
Oh my God, I'm like, I feel like I'm the wrong person because I am so anti that. I think I just want to start with this work. I think I'm gonna go back to Kata and Sarah, like about like historically, this work is deeply rooted on the ground. It's deeply rooted from the individuals who are victims, survivors of any forms of violence, systemic oppressions, violence. So they are rooted from the elders, right? They are rooted from Harriet Tubman. It's rooted from Marsha Johnson, right? So it's just deeply rooted from the work, the activism, the political activism of survivors throughout the history of the violence in the United States. It's rooted with, for me, it's that. And then VAWA came. I'm just gonna name it, Violence Against Women's Act came. And I think our elders, especially the women of color who had pushed for VAWA, did not expect the what do you call it, what's going to happen with the work, right? So I think when that radical part of it, when it's like the ground is kind of, it's taken from the ground, now it's now becoming maybe the trunk, and now it's becoming the branches, right? So for me, VAWA is just one of the branches of our work, of this movement. So it's just one of the branches. But then that, for me, when VAWA comes in, and then when there's money that's coming in, the need for control of that money also is a result of that professionalization, the need for social workers, the need for therapists, the need for this, the need for that, right? The need for attorneys. So, but those are needed. I'm not saying they're not needed, but then it's like, how how then do we come back to that radical root that it is coming from? I think this is the time where we need to combine both, because for me, if VAWA is one branch, there is also other branches that we need to look at. So I think it's not the, I always think about the tree, because I think, you know, we all have different paths. Our work have, you know, all of us have strengths, have weaknesses. So we need to look at those paths as a way of one, but our mission is kind of the same, but we will have different paths. And then the over professionalization is also a result of like the criminal justice system, right? It's also the result of mandatory reporting that we don't think about how it's going to affect youth, right? So for me, over professionalization is when there's an act, you know, it becomes a part of the system. So it's coming from like, it's again then connected to Audre Lorde, what Kata had used last week, like you cannot dismantle the master's house using, but then I think, in my opinion, it's like, we are just different branches, and now it's the time just to kind of come back and then figure out how then can we work together. The ones who are doing mainstream work, the ones who are doing culturally specific work, the one who are doing tribal work, the one who are doing, because we're all together, right? But the way that we will do things will be different. So for me, I think what it also means is coming back then to community organizing. How then we can come back to the community, because the community is crucial to this work. The solutions is in the community. So for us, for example, at Monsoon, we hire staff who are not sometimes college graduate. They are maybe just got a GED. So valuing the strength of an individual who speaks the language, who's a cultural insiders, but might not have an MSW. We don't need MSWs. We want the community insiders, the one who are cultural insiders, right? Because sometimes the one who has the MSW are the one that are liable, are going to kind of like, they have to report, they have to do all this stuff, right? But community insiders, no, they are just really accountable to the community. And this also comes with hiring youth, creating programming that's specifically for the youth. How then do we include youth in the program and not just a token? Oh, we need a panel, let's bring in the youth, but you never really work with the youth. So for me, I think the over professionalization, I'm so glad that we're talking about this, because we need to kind of like question that. And then that also include then, what is the definition of professionalization? Is it like following mainstream Western ways? Does it mean culturally, can we be culturally specific and be professional? I think we need to have that definition of like professional could also mean different in different communities. It could mean you speak the language. It means that you are respectful of elders. It means that you cannot, yeah, I'm close to time. So, okay, so I just want to kind of make sure that when we're thinking about professionalization, that we are also like valuing the community, cultural insiders, and making sure that they just get the so-called training or education in how to do the work. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Mira. You were absolutely the right person to ask that question to. And I thank you so much for your responses. And one thing that did show up that we began to discuss last week in that breakout session was the characteristics of white supremacy culture and that tie to this over professionalization of advocacy. So thank you so much. And Guadalupe, I'd like to turn to you and see what you think about all this and what you might say about this over professionalization of advocacy.
Sure, I think Mira was right on, right? And I think it actually connects to what Kenosha, Sarah, and Kata have already been saying, right? It's like the history of our movement, the resistance to gender oppression has existed long before VAWA, long before the first feminist. It started when the first woman who was battered spat in her husband's dinner, right? It happens still today when the migrant crosses the border, right? It's the acts of resistance that that aren't necessarily captured in the history books and seen as like policy advocacy forms of winning the movement, right? And so like Sarah said, right, the solution is connecting with the communities in which we experience violence and in the same communities that we're working towards that freedom from violence, right? And sometimes what holds us back is the professionalization, right? Okay, we got VAWA, and from VAWA, there were certain ways that programs have to act their work. And with that, right, you have an attorney on your team, they are bound to the ethical rules of attorneys and the bar of the state. And the social worker is barred to the ethical bars and rules of their profession. And so like, as we all start getting the titles, right, we're very restricted, right? And then you start seeing things like professional boundaries with your client, right? And so then your conversations with your client move into like, I'm just gonna do the intake and follow the form and fill it out and move on and give you your service and buy. Instead of talking about, right, like the greater roots of oppression, right? The capitalism even that fuels why we are where we're at today in this movement, because we're fighting for money and scraps and resources and crumbs. And we can be having liberating conversations with that client that is coming through the door, right? And so, you know, in many ways, right, the rules and the ways we do our work, me as a frontline hotline advocate, or as the manager of X program, or as the director of X organization, right? We have all of these rules that guide our work and tell us how to do it. And then we feel like we're stuck. Well, we can't hire community organizers because the government grant didn't give us money for that. They only gave us money for one therapist. And then, you know, because the system itself, right, you know, if we were actually fighting to liberate ourselves from capitalism and white supremacy and gender oppression, right, there is no incentive for those in power to give us resources to fight for that, right? So sometimes the liberation may not happen within our organizations or within my job description and title, but what are the small avenues that we can continue to do that, right? If I am gonna sit down and have time to do an intake with a survivor of violence, let me get to know her, let me like connect, right? Let us talk about the roots and how it's everywhere we go, right? The oppression and the rhetoric is everywhere, right? It's that, I think I learned this at Praxis, right? It's the smog that we're all inhaling that is keeping us oppressed. So yeah, you know, how do we move beyond it? It's in being in community with your fellow advocates within your 9 to 5. When you sit down and have lunch, what are you talking about, right? Or after that tough call, or you're having a case debriefing, let's connect it to that greater system, right? Sometimes it actually validates us and makes us feel better and like, okay, and this is why we're all here and we're all working to fight it, right? This is my piece to it, and this is her piece to it and their piece to it. And the way you're connecting with your clients, the way you're connecting with the partners that even are outside of the gender violence movement, right? And we can talk more about that at the next couple of questions, but partnering with those and intersecting movements, right? Healthcare for all, right? Things like that at the end of the day actually benefits the survivors we're working with, or our work and our movement. So I'll leave it there, and I'm excited to hear everyone else.
Great. Thank you so much, Guadalupe and Mira, for your thoughts on all of that. And I know one thing that has come up both in your responses just now, and then I think Kenosha mentioned it, as well as the ways that funding and some of the structures that we operate within influence how we do our work. And Amalfi, I know that came up in your group, so I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that and what that conversation was in your small group.
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for what all of you have been sharing so far. And I am feeling that thread and connection between everything that you all are talking about. And I think it all continues to flow here into the question that I would like to pose for you all. When as advocates, we start centering anti-oppression in our advocacy, and we start paying attention to all of the unique and different needs of the diverse people and groups in our communities that you all have described, you know, and talked about being in space with and connecting to elders in those spaces. When we start doing that, we start identifying new and unique ways of how we need to provide advocacy, right, to meet those needs of what's in community. And I was really excited by examples a lot of folks were sharing in the group I was in of ways that they have started intentionally listening to needs of different folks in community and providing services to meet those needs, not and doing that in ways that's not about the grant objective that was written like 2 years ago, right, in a grant that, you know, application that was submitted that you like now have funding for. But what some of what that raised that relates to the professionalization piece you just talked about and the history and how kind of institutionalization kind of came into a radical movement with the institution of VAWA, right? But so we know that with keeping that in mind and seeing how current funding sources really structure our work in ways that often do not fit the needs of what we're seeing community really needs. What strategies or ideas for funding have you seen working for advocates who are centering their advocacy on anti-oppression and really focusing on meeting the needs of community? Have you seen funding that has successfully supported that, or strategies and tips you could offer for that? And either Mira or Kenosha, I don't know if either of you have a preference of starting, but do either of you have any thoughts on this?
So I'll go ahead and answer the question. One of the things, and Sarah knows that this is one of my favorite areas, and I typically like show me the money, right? And so I think it's about organizations really looking at how they're deciding to, looking at their funding strategies. And so my 5 keys to increasing revenue is like building the capacity of your team. A lot of times the focus is like, oh, that's the EG job or that's the development person's job. In reality it's the jobs of all of us within an organization. So working with board staff and volunteers to develop a strategy, and to also, like, everybody should have an elevator speech. You know, a lot of time we're in places and spaces that we don't even realize that potential donors that will be outside of the VOCA VAWA funding is present, but we don't know. We don't share with our staff what, you know, sometimes you have an executive director who may not share with their staff what are some future plans and programs. And one of the things that I teach people to do is like have 3 things that people can pitch at all times with a full idea of what those 3 things would be. You know, whether that's the Leadership Institute, right? Because we're talking about how do we change future advocates. Leadership Institute, and have an idea of what that costs. And so I typically have like 3 pet projects that I'm hoping to launch in the next 2 to 3 years, and that my staff also are aware of that, my board's aware of that, volunteers, so that when they have those rare opportunities, that it's a go. And that way that donor feels really comfortable about it, you know, that they're confident in the knowledge, like, oh, they already had a plan together. It's not like, let me go put something together for you, right? Also making sure that we're dedicating the time. And, you know, people have to really be intentional about the time that they spend looking for different revenue strategies. Yes, there's 101 people that need us. Yes, there's staff that needs things. Yes, there's everybody needs us, right? But you have to be really intentional and blocking off a window of time in which to look at for those different revenue sources, right? And knowing too what your strengths are. If it's not you, then go find the people that can do that for you, right? Um, and so that comes to the next key, which is identifying and making connections. One of the things that I tell myself and also my staff is get out of your seat, physically getting out of your seat. And I know we can't really do that in time of COVID, so bear with me. That was a pre-COVID key. And then 2, getting out of the seat in which you work. A lot of times we represent whole counties, whole regions, whole states, but we tend to kind of only do work in the seat of that county or the seat of that state. And it's like, nope, you really have to get out there and go to your most furthest reach in that state, in that county, in that, especially if you have rural communities, you're really missing the opportunity, right, to make connections that could lead to doing things differently. And so identifying and making connection. And then the fourth key is really challenging for a lot of organizations because we have the belief like nonprofits aren't supposed to make a revenue, and that's not a true statement. Diversifying the revenue of your organization, right? Connecting to private foundation. Most of us are not aware or aren't connected with the nonprofit council in your community. That is a place that is full of a wealth of knowledge and resources of who has the money, right? And so that's a great place to kind of do that at. And so consider connecting to your nonprofit council in your area. Another scary area for people that I just love to throw out there is investment income. Yes, nonprofits can have investment income. Being intentional about building a nest egg. And it starts small, right? A lot of people's like, well, we don't have 100,000, we don't have 50. And it's like, no, we can do miracles with 5. And so maybe you're intentionally starting with a savings account and then you're moving the organization to an investment income. Because then what happens is that you can do programming difference just off the gains of that investment income, right? And so just really reaching out to think about how you do your revenue plans and strategies differently. And fifth and final key is always thinking outside of the box, right? A lot of time we stick with stuff that we know that isn't working. Here we go, the gala, it's going to take us 200 staff hours and it's going to cost us 30,000 and we're going to raise 15,000. And I'm like, now math is not my major, right? But I'm sure that's not a winning formula. So thinking outside of the box, not being afraid to do something differently. If we wanted to do different programming, it's like learn to color within the lines, but also throw away all the lines, get outside of the box, and look for some non-traditional funding sources that will allow you to do the things that you want to do. You'll be amazed if you have a well-built plan put together and is able to sell it to donors or private foundations. They will back you. And especially around the lens of anti-oppression work. And I will put this caveat out there. If you're a mainstream organization, do not gobble just because you can gobble. Allow for spaces and places for culturally specific organizations to get that funding, because that's how mainstream organizations like myself show up and support the culturally specific organizations, right? Because part of our anti-oppression lens or framework is going to be about making sure that everyone that should be at the table is at the table and have access to the table. So we don't have to eat it all just because it's there. So I do want to plug that as well. So I'll stop.
That was awesome. Each of those step keys were really helpful. I know we have a note taker recording and I'm still like typing as you're talking. It's really helpful and really practical things we can think about for funding. So Mira, do you have anything that you can provide for us related to funding?
Oh, Kenosha, you're gonna like, Mira, you got no plan. I got no plan. I just want to tell you all that because I just like, I'm listening to you. I was like, oh my God, I'm just like totally like, I need to like write this down. So, but for us, I think how we do funding strategy is what are our core values, right? So I really start with our core values. And then basically that will inform how we will kind of have a funding strategy that sometimes, to be honest with you, Monsoon doesn't. Because for us, when we think about sustainability, because I think this is all about sustainability, sustaining the work that we do. For us, sometimes we should not think about just money or funding as a way to sustain the work. So for me, again, I'm going to go back to the community component where we need to invest also with the individuals, with our community, right? So then that's how we start, is investment in building relationship with community members, with our whole community, not just like where we are at, but also nationally. That's how I see it. And then we at Monsoon specifically, we started poor. We are so poor. It was just me, myself, and I in the very beginning with a very limited funding. And then from then, I love grant writing. So I immediately applied for OVW money, right? So then I got them. So 99%, like back in the day, like 99% of our funding is federal and state. And then also like Iowa Department of Public Health. But then as I built relationship with community members and like sister friends, right, across nationally, I started building relationship with foundations. And through that foundation, we started like got some major money from one foundation that we can do international work. And then that kind of like started like all of a sudden, like a lot of foundation are giving us more money without me going there asking for money. So I was like, what is going on? So for me, I think it's this like lack of plan, but then it's just lack of building relationship with individuals that I think that are my sisters, my, you know, my relatives, just like what Sarah was saying, like building that relationship. So now we're really rethinking about how we will do and sustain this work if we no longer have any more money. So that is about then the community will need to continue our work in serving survivors and victims. So then we will just do a lot of community education. And then second of all, I think how then do we create like a workers collective? How then do we create a different way of looking at this work differently? And also building in survivors and victims as part of that in creating like a business that can basically have a economic part of it at the same time that we are doing community work. So for me, I think that when I'm thinking about strategy, I'm just really relying on building relationships. Like another example is, okay, so for women of color specifically, BIPOC women, is sometimes we have to work harder than white women. It seems like we have to prove ourselves that we can do this work, right? So my experience here in Iowa, where it's 97% white, no, 93% white, but we're just really small. Like I have to work harder in order for them to like just look at us and invest in us. And that's tiring. And this is the reason why sometimes we have to move away from that. But then they gave us a house to renovate. But then I started working with that house then became like our capital, right? In order for us to gain more money or to get more funding. And then we give it out to the community because we're supposed to be nonprofit. So we have to give it out. So I'm going to do like the Muslim ways, like, you know, like for me, it's the blessings that I receive and then how to give it back to the community and not keep it like as a capitalist. So yeah. So for me, got no plans. So Kenosha, thank you so much for that because now I need to have a plan. But yes, so funding strategy is just really building relationships for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Mira and Kenosha. It's so good. I love hearing all the different approaches to thinking about this. And like, this is why we need spaces like this to have these conversations and hear all the different approaches and ways of thinking about these questions that we're all grappling with in different ways. So unfortunately, we are getting close to the end of our time together today. I know we didn't get to all of the breakout groups, But I think a lot of the questions and things that came up were already discussed in other ways by many of the panelists. But I do want to say that this is not the end of the conversation. I think that we're excited to find ways to continue this conversation at future events in whatever ways that looks like. And so we'll be sharing a link to the evaluation of today's session in the chat, and would just really encourage everyone to fill it out and tell us more about what would you like to see us keep talking about at future events. What things weren't there time for today that maybe we can have on the agenda to talk about with each other at some point in the future. So to kind of bring us home and wrap us all up, I'm just going to ask each panelist to have a little bit of a closing statement and share one action to kind of bring us full circle back to Sarah and Kenosha and the action and practice. And each of you, if you could just share one practical action that advocates or folks listening in today could take or integrate into their daily work and practice to put all of these fabulous ideas and things we've been talking about into motion. So, Sarah, I wonder if I can start with you, and then we'll just go through the other panelists while we wrap up.
Dang it, I was like, don't start with me, don't start with me.
You should have signaled me.
I think one, really practical action is take a look at your social media and newsletters, those kinds of things that you're doing. Take a look at that and see what your percentage of where you're elevating voices of BIPOC women, cis and trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, how much of what you promote and who you consider thought leaders, what percentage of that are those folks? That would be my practical step.
Thank you, Sarah. Guadalupe, what about you?
Yeah, get to know, I think similar, get to know to your community, but like get to know your fellow community organizer, the one that's out there like dealing with the housing instability crisis and pushing forward tenants' rights. The one that's over here trying to pass whatever legislative bills related to immigrants, right? The DREAM Act and Promise Act, because all of these different issues, right? Those that are pushing for healthcare for all, and build partnership with them, build coalition with them if you can. If you can't within your traditional role, fine. But are you doing it outside your 9 to 5, right? Because at the end of the day, when we have these kinds of liberations, right, for different aspects of our community, it's actually leading towards this world without violence, right? Where then we don't even have to talk about the services that we need for post-violence, right? Like law enforcement as a service after violence. But what about these other things that we can be building to be building safer communities? So reach out to your friendly community organizers in every issue area in your county.
Awesome. I feel like we need that on a poster, like reach out to your friendly neighborhood organizer today. Little phone numbers for people to call. Thank you, Guadalupe. Kenosha, what about you?
I'm going to refer back to what I said earlier, that taking conversations from spaces like this and asking yourself the how do I do this? And creating an actionable list, but then also making sure that you're allowing for grace for yourself, right? Because all of it seems like we need to do this now. We need to do this yesterday, really, right? And so knowing that the best way to build a house is one brick at a time, one stone at a time. And so knowing that it's a process too. So create that list and then, get with other individuals that can help you to do things differently.
Thank you, Kenosha. Mira, what would you say?
I am like totally, I feel like I overthought, so I got nothing except this. Like, I was reading this, he's Vietnamese and he does a lot of work with foundations. And he basically kind of shared this one article from Medium about Asian American women are resilient. I think my last thought right now is this: we heal, we pause, we allow ourselves to be in wellness. And when we fully recover, we take action. I just love that because it's all about pausing and then just, slowly, like maybe then we can take some actions. So I think, especially at this moment, I think it's just important to pause. And then be in wellness. It's like, how then do we totally embody wellness? And then act after like you're ready. So yeah, so I know it doesn't have anything to do with this, but I that's just my last thought.
No, thank you. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think that's something that each of us can think about. How do we pause? What does it mean for us to be well?
Yeah.
To act from a place of wellness, not a place of reactivity or white supremacy or all the other things that have been talked about. So I think that was a beautiful last thought that was very relevant. And Kata, any closing thoughts from you?
Sure. Thank you. Well, first of all, just on behalf of Praxis, I want to thank all the panelists personally for having this time with you and our participants for joining all these really powerful sessions. I've learned a lot. I actually am going to take a little last person and maybe oldest person privilege and say two things. One is just a short extrapolation of what a few others have said, which is I would really challenge folks to take what you learned from these conversations and think about 2 or 3 practical questions that you can use to guide your work daily in every decision and every moment. Those questions will depend on who you are and what you do and what you're trying to achieve. I worked at a domestic violence program where we felt that our work was about supporting survivors, holding accountable those who had caused harm, and changing the climate that led to violence in the first place. So our questions, every decision we made was, how does this support survivors? And is it possible it doesn't? How does this hold those who caused harm accountable and encourage their change, whether it's an individual or a group that's caused harm? And how are we changing the climate that leads to the violence in the first place? So I think though that's not the questions I'm suggesting, but I encourage people to find a frame like that you use on a regular basis. So it's not just that you went to this one webinar and or one talk story. And the last thing I want to say is I want to, with some emotion, given the tender time that Amanda acknowledged, I just want to speak to the BIPOC and queer and trans folks that are on this call. The Asian American, the Black, the Latinx, the Arab, the Iranian, the West Asian, the immigrants, the queer, trans. I just want you to know that you're not alone, that we are in this together. And I know that we have the wonderful benefit of having this very diverse panel. And I know that when I started doing this work as an Iranian immigrant, lesbian, woman of color, I felt very alone. And so I really want to say to all of those of you that might be listening, I hope if nothing else, this panel gives you the message that you are not alone, that you matter, and that what you do every day is so important, not just for you and your community, but for all of us. And we are here for you. So if Praxis can support you or help you, we are there for you. And I see the other panelists nodding their heads, and I know that they are too. But I hope that every BIPOC, queer, trans person who's on this call will leave this knowing that you are part of our community, and that is something that will stay with you always as you move forward.
Thank you, Kata. Don't think there could have been a better way to wrap up our time here together today. So thank you so much for all of that. And again, deep gratitude to Sarah and Kenosha and Mira and Guadalupe for being here with us and having this conversation and sharing space with us. Truly, it's been amazing. So thank you to all of the participants who joined us today. Elena did copy the link to the evaluation into the chat. Mira also had shared a link to the article and the quote that she had mentioned and that she shared. But so please fill out the evaluations and let us know what you would like to see more of in the future. And hopefully this is the first of many of these types of conversations that we'll be able to have with all of you. So thank you again. Mahalo, everybody. And hopefully we'll see each other soon.